I'm here today to talk about CISSP in your career on behalf of InfosecTrain. So I'll keep the video on just briefly as I give this sort of first little introduction, and then I'll probably turn my video off and we'll just focus on the slide deck. So my name is Matthew Ford. I'm going to go into more about my background and my profile, but as a bit of a preamble, who I am. I'm a Canadian expat. I currently live in the United Kingdom, and I've been living out here for well over 20 years. Just turned 50 the other day. And I'm very happy to be working with InfosecTrain and hopefully excite you a little bit, give you some insight into what CISSP, what the program is about, what it can do for your career, what some of the requirements, your study expectations are going to be, and what you're going to get out of training in the future. So with that being said, and I'll give you a little more a taste of my background shortly, but we'll move on into the actual slide deck. Bear with me, I'm trying to move the slide here. So for today's webinar, we're going to talk about, firstly, a better introduction to myself. I'll take you through accreditation and training, breakdown on the exam structure and what's required for this, followed by a brief preview of each of the domains with some of the summaries of the information that would be expected to be studying in each of those domains. It's quite a wide variety of topics. I'll also provide some exam preparation, some study tips, bring you into the benefits of having a CISSP. I'll even share some of the benefits I've certainly experienced in the somewhat 15 years that I've had the accreditation for. And we'll end the session with Q&A and any questions you might have for me that I can perhaps elaborate more on what we've talked about, and we'll take it from there. So quick background for me, like I said, I've been living in the UK for a considerable amount of time now, working for a number of different FTSE 100 companies. I went from the military background to private sector and intelligence, very similar to cybersecurity in what we try to identify and mitigate the risk of threats, whether it be military or cyber. Today, as we understand, cyber is a big facet of the military. But my background comes from that, and I think it was only natural that even after spending about 5 years in Unix systems administration and operations, that I would gravitate towards the cybersecurity and governance and risk. And so while I worked for Citibank, they had a program on CISSP that excited me. I thought, wow, that could be certainly a benefit to my career. And we're going back now to about 2006 when I first heard about it. And I embarked on my own personal self-study. I finally took the exam in 2007. After that, it motivated me to take some more training, where I took the CISM from another organization, isaca. After that, a few more years of practitioner work, I thought maybe it's time I probably go back to university, where I did a master's degree in information technology security at the University of Westminster. And now where I find myself 20 plus years later, having a background and working in a number of different companies, both as permanent information security officer roles, technical ISO roles. I've also worked as a consultant for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, formerly or now known as DXC. And I've spent a number of years as well doing contracting, eventually getting involved into teaching, which is something I think passionately I always knew I was going to become. I was always going to teach. I think it was something that my grandfather, that was his career pursuit, and I always felt I'd probably follow the same thing, and here I am today. So sharing with a little bit of my background, and I'm a typical Canadian. I'm much more European in my approach to life now. 3 kids, 3 teenage, virtually adult children, married 25 years. And a little bit about my background is I like to work in the film industry part-time, which I've done some pretty exciting stuff that perhaps I'll show some more of that, and I'll share some of that experience. Some of my stories and experiences when we ever do take a course with me. And I've got some pretty credible photos to share with you. But let's focus now more on the actual content about what we're here today and what I'm trying to impart to you for the benefit of the webinar. So really what I want to do is I want to give you an understanding about the background of the CISSP. Now, this program has been running for a number of years, since 1994. It's certainly the world-leading cybersecurity membership association. So ISC Square is the accreditation body that sponsors not only the CISSP, but I will show you a number of other security accreditation courses they do as well. CISSP being the sort of gold standard in IT security certification, especially when you're moving away from, perhaps if you started off in a more technical type role and you decide to pursue your career amongst information security, governance, risk, compliance. You'll see that CISSP is certainly a benefit to your career. It's certainly a promotion enabler. I received a promotion doing it. I was fortunate enough to be in a competition for a job at the time, and CISSP wasn't that widely available. Now it has become very competitive out there in the workplace. CISSP is one of those accreditations that a lot of HR professionals certainly ask for going into certain types of roles. It's also a means to increasing your knowledge and vocabulary. Now, I would never tell anybody from any IT background never to pursue a CISSP, that you don't need to have a career ambition to go into cybersecurity for a CISSP to be a benefit you. Far from it. Anybody from being a systems administrator to working from a help desk, CISSP gives you a very good, well-rounded career, a good vocabulary, good knowledge. It exposes you to a lot of topics that you probably wouldn't have had access to before, from networking and telecoms, encryption, project management, and a number of other areas. And the CISSP course is very good at giving you a high-level concentration of understanding so that you can be very articulate in conversations on this subject matter. So you can also engage in discussions and or projects where otherwise you would have had, let's say, certain academic limitations. It's certainly good for vetting, because once you're a member of the ISC Square, you now are a member of a professional body, which they expect certain behaviors, which calls for ethics. And by being a member of ISC Square, your adherence to the ethics is really about promoting the profession of cybersecurity, not just for yourself, but for all cybersecurity professionals around the world. So by being a member of that organization, ISC Square, there's an expectation that your behavior must be commensurate to the ethical requirements. So any third party or any company that wanting to hire you can use ISC Square to vet the fact that you have an accreditation. So that certainly helps. But also, as a member, there's a lot that you bring to the organization, which ISC Square benefits from itself as well. So we'll talk briefly about the exam. The exam is changed a lot over the number of years. Previously, when I wrote the exam, it was 6 hours, and it was pencil and paper, and it wasn't automated or computer assisted, or sorry, computer adaptive learning as it is today. So when you see the term CAT, we're talking about computer adaptive learning. So the CISSP program, the Certified Information System Security Professional, broken into eight different domains. And you can see each of these domains has a percentage weight against each of the topics. They generally don't change too much, from 10% up to 15%, but no more than that. The exam itself is 3 hours long and works on the number of items and number of questions. You'll receive at a minimum 100, but no more than 150. And why is there a variation? Purely because the way the scoring of the examination works is it's persistently evaluating your competency and knowledge against each of these domains. It's important that to pass the examination, you need to have a passing mark within each of the domains. When you answer enough questions to demonstrate superior knowledge, the examination will focus on other domains. Once you've achieved a high level of competency on all 8 domains, then your examination will end at a point where the computer system determines that you have superior knowledge and you're ready to pass. So it may not force you across all 150 exam questions, or you may have to do all 150 questions. At the end of the day, when the computer system decides to terminate the exam, it will have done so in order to, because it's happy that you're confident at answering the questions, or you may have failed in one of the domains. At minimum, it will still give you at least 100 exams to give you a proper run through the examination, but only at the very end of the exam grading system will you find out if you've been successful, or you'll have to retake the exam again. If you're successful in the exam, you'll be only given a pass mark. You won't be told how much you passed. If you're unsuccessful, you'll be given a breakdown of which of the domains that you had the most trouble with, and you'll have some specific guidance on how to better focus and hone your skills for the next time. Now, when I did the exam myself, and it was 6 hours, it was quite a crunch. I used every bit of those 6 hours, and I admit I was not successful my first try. I missed it by a few points. However, I got back on the horse and I studied again, and I made sure I registered for the next available exam within 2 months. And the second time I wrote the exam, I did it in 3.5 hours. And now I knew I was very confident at that time. And I'm glad that I had to rewrite the exam again, because by studying more, I learned more, and I came out of there with a far more confident perception of how well I did and felt that I'd earned that accreditation. And it hasn't changed today as well. It's not uncommon for people to have to write the exam more than once. I think I won't get into any percentage of pass marks, because I'm not here to represent any training centers, any View Pearson centers. As you can see here, there are only authorized PPC or PVTC select Pearson View testing centers that ISC Square authorizes for testing. When it comes to testing, we can discuss where exactly your local testing center would be during an actual training course, but I'm not really going to cover that today because we've got people from quite a wide different geography. But I hope that in a nutshell, that is the breakdown of the examination. And it's a challenge. It's a lot of shifting gears. You will get questions that will start in one domain, and the next question might immediately go to a different domain. And then you go to domain 3, domain 4, back to domain 1, domain 6. So mastery of knowledge is about making sure that you are confident that you can answer those questions, all of the questions, to a sufficient or a satisfactory level. All right, so that's the summary of the exam. And please, if you've got questions, just jot them down and I can answer them at the end. I'm happy to go back to certain slides if it helps with the questions. So now we'll move on to the next slide, pathway to certification. So it's not rocket science, really, when we're talking about how do we get certified and what that pathway is. We're really looking at making sure that the CISSP is the right course for you. There are other courses, but traditionally, the foundation of cybersecurity revolves around the CISSP course. So this, or when we say the CISSP or the CISSP course, it's certainly for experienced practitioners. However, the caveat stipulates that you should have 5 years or more experience working generally in one of these following positions. If you don't have the 5 years experience, it doesn't mean you can't take the exam. If you're fresh out of university or a recent grad hard, you've been in a role for a couple of years, you can still take the examination if you so choose to do it. All it simply states is that if you pass the exam, then you become an associate member until such time that you can gain the final of the 5 years experience that you need. So generally, to qualify for the exam, you need 5 years experience, but you can do the exam and be an associate member. And then once you've, again, reached the 5 years in your career field, you can then reapply to IEC Square. Of course, you'll be a member of IEC, but you can reapply to have your associate status removed and have full status as an IEC CISSP qualified member. And so these number of positions that we see, from security manager, auditor, architects, are the traditional roles that we quite often see. And every time I've taught this course, there's always a mixed match of people from, I see pen testers, I do see everybody here, and I'm increasingly seeing more, which doesn't list here, but I'm starting to see lawyers on my course. So I've seen that on a number of occasions. I was just teaching CISSP a couple of times in 2020 to the Maltese government, and noticed I had a few lawyers on the course. With the age of data protection starting to become increasingly prominent in the world, I'm certainly seeing, more interest from other professional areas. But I would encourage anybody and everybody to pursue the qualification at no matter what state the career is in. Just have reasonable expectations that you do require 5 years of experience to be certified by your employer, so that IEC Square can be satisfied that you do have the correct requirement before you're awarded the accreditation. And I can go into this a little bit more detail in the Q&A session. But we do like to say that, it isn't for everyone. And when I say that it's not for everyone, it could be because there might be other accreditation courses that I'm not going to go into in detail, but IEC Square does offer accreditation in everything from security administration, cloud security, secure software development, security assessment and authorization, as well as healthcare security and privacy, whether that's relevant in your area. It's predominantly based around the American HIPAA model, but nevertheless, there are other accreditation courses you can embark on, whether it's CISSP that you do first, or you choose to do one of these accreditations first. That's entirely up to you. But we're certainly here to focus our conversation on the CISSP program. Once you have had the CISSP, then you're more than welcome to study and engage with InfosecTrain on embarking on other training courses, which we can, again, provide webinars for later on. So we talk about the cybersecurity program and the different domains. So what are those domains? So we have 8 of them. The first one is security and risk management. So security and risk management covers frameworks, concepts, principles, structures, all the things that are necessary in order to establish a criteria. Sorry, I'm just trying to move something across my screen here because I'm blocked from what I'm reading. All right, sorry, let's just rewind that. So it covers frameworks, policies, concepts, standards that are used to establish the criteria for the protection of your information assets and to assess the effectiveness of that protection. Now, we don't just talk about tangible information assets, intangible, like digital documentation, but CISSP focuses on a wider view of security, such as physical security and operational security. So when we talk about assets really means everybody. It means every employee, every role. It means your digital data. It means your physical documentation, paperwork. Anything that is of perceived value to an organization would be considered an asset. And so when we talk about the protection of assets, we're talking about really the protection of everything that fits that category, that classification. Of course, every organization will value or determine their own asset inventory uniquely or differently, but of course, there will always be common threads to those asset registries. And so the different roles that we would see, that we would focus on in this domain, would be the security architect, in terms of the person responsible for the security architecture of the enterprise. We look at the security practitioner and their responsibility in terms of tactical and operational elements, looking at the infrastructure. And then there's the security professional, the people that are responsible for the managerial oversight of the security elements of the organization. Within the actual domain itself, the domain looks at a little bit more detail now. It talks about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is virtually the very first lesson. We will talk in more detail about security governance, compliance requirements. We'll get into ethics and legal regulatory issues, policy, standards, procedures, all the fundamental building blocks that are necessary for any information security management program. We'll talk about business continuity. At one point, business continuity used to be a separate domain. Now it has been reorganized, and business continuity and resiliency will be a topic that will be discussed in more than one domain, from not just business continuity, but also from a disaster recovery point of view. We'll talk about risk management, threat modeling, third-party supply chain risk. Definitely a very important element of cybersecurity that organizations are coming to better terms with. And awareness, training, and education. What is important about an awareness and training education program? What are the implications for not investing in awareness and training? And what are the implications to use an organization that, should you receive a breach, how would that impact possible penalties, whether it's judgmental, whether it's a fine? The lack of having an information and training program could be the difference between negligent to actually being perceived as reckless. And when we say reckless, we mean not even doing anything to even try to educate staff, right? Second domain. The second domain, we'll talk about asset security. You can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see an asset lifecycle. We'll cover a lot of different life cycles, but we all have a start point and an end point. When we talk about any type of life cycle, it really ends in a secure state of whatever the system is, whether it's software development or whether it's disposing of assets. How do we do things not just from a normal IT management point of view? How do we do it with a secure point of view so that we don't, again, experience things like data loss protection? Okay, physical assets are one thing, but the critical asset is the data that resides on those physical assets. And so when we look at asset lifecycle, we look at three different phases about the data of those assets. We have to consider things like, if the data is at rest, how do we secure that data? We do things like we encrypt it as a number one priority. If the data is in motion, well, where is it in motion to? From where's the point of origin to the destination? And that, again, will bring in different network protocols, understanding of the operational system interconnect model, and the right type of encryption mechanism to employ, especially if you're leaving one domain and moving to another domain. And then there's the data in use. And of course, how do we secure data in order to make sure that the data that's in use can only be accessed by those that have a necessary job requirement to access that data, right? When we talk about classification of information, we talk about roles, profiles, we'll talk about different models of how do we attribute access entitlements to data. And it's also important that not just that you have access to that data, but that you have a need for access, that you have a right to have access, that you have a functional requirement. The third domain, we'll talk about security architecture and engineering. So security engineering domain contains concepts and principles and structures, the standards used to design, how do we implement and monitor, especially when we're looking at monitoring secure operating systems, the equipment, the networks, all the applications and the controls. The key thing here are the controls that we use to enforce the different aspects of the CIA model, the confidentiality, the integrity, availability. Everything we do when we look at data and we look at assets and we are considering the dimension of risk is all about whether or not does it have a confidentiality risk issue to it. Is it just integrity? It could be a combination of both. Or is it just about availability? We have to dimension these problems in context to each of those elements of the CIA model. And we also have to go back to the last slide and also consider, and so if the data is confidential, is it in motion? Is it in use? we have to, again, combine those other concepts to come up with the best, most pragmatic and risk-free choice, or the most risk-averse choice, based on the guidance from our executive management on how we're going to protect those assets and that infrastructure. You can see on the screen here, there's just an image of somebody named Bruce Schneier, who's absolute security expert in the US. And he's right when he says, if you think technology can solve your security problems, then you don't understand the problems and you don't understand security. Because so much of what we do and what we learn through the CISSP and then through our experience as practitioners is that most of the problems that we walk into are usually self-created. It's usually because we've forgotten to do something, we've not trained people properly to anticipate risk, or we don't have the proper risk management programs in place, that we don't know what to do with risk once we identify it, let alone are we documenting risk, do we have to register, and what are the protocols in place? And so this domain will help us understand what we should be doing given certain risk conditions. And a lot of this, it all comes down to our ability to apply critical thinking. Domain 4, we'll get into more technical elements. The aim of the security program is to ensure that the business will carry on unimpeded by security threats, whether those threats are external, internal, or technical. So it's really about resiliency, isn't it? It's about technical resiliency and being able to ensure that we're always ready to handle a problem and be able to respond, at least with enough information that we can make the types of decisions that we need to make given a particular crisis. So the best plan is just a plan, but the more detailed that plan is, then the more it will aid us in the decisions we have to make. Because at the end of the day, what happens at the time of an incident or a crisis will always be unique to that element or to that situation. So this domain will get us into understanding a little bit more about, let's say, concepts that are hard to witness and visualize. So we'll talk about the OSI model, and we'll teach you about what happens to data in its lowest level when it's at the bit level and it's at the physical layer of the system. And then it moves up into the data link level and then the network and the transport, all the way until it finally gets into a usable format to your front-end application system, whether it's in PowerPoint, a web browser. And really it's about understanding each of these layers, what the protocols are involved in each of these layers, understanding how could these layers be attacked, and furthermost, how do you defend against those attacks? So you can anticipate and then apply the right type of security decisions to protect each layer. Because we look at each of these layers, and all but one, there's only one layer that doesn't actually have its own security protocols. It relies upon the security presented either above or below that layer. But nevertheless, each of these layers represents specific risks that need to be addressed. And when you finish this training program, you will have a very good understanding of that. And not only will you have a very good understanding, but your ability to then further make decisions or engage in more technical projects will allow you to understand when you're dealing with the encryption element or the networking parts, or you're having to deal with the application people. Your job is to consolidate all of those relationships and to work with people that would represent the management of infrastructure at each of these layers. And so as a security practitioner, your job is to understand what happens at each of these layers, so you can help negotiate and project manage the right solutions that would be necessary. And so we're going to look a little bit more at this domain, such as how do we apply secure design principles, how protocols converge, and understanding a little bit more about networking and networking components, and how we can understand the difference between standard infrastructure or networking, and how do we have to actually secure that infrastructure. Domain 5, we get into identity access management, Idam or IAM, depending on where you come up from in the world. And this domain will cover the process of allowing either only authorized users or programs of other computer systems to observe, modify, or otherwise take possession of the resources of a computer system. It's also a mechanism for limiting the use of some resources to authorized users. So when we look at a computer system, we create identities based on employees or users, technical or system identities that have to be managed as well. And both of those identities, whether it's for a user or it's for a system level, have to be designed in such a way and controlled that we don't have, let's say, breaches to our security models, so that people don't have access to information they shouldn't have access to, whether they can only view information and they can't write to it, or they can write to it, but only only write down, let's say, they can't write to higher sensitive data. And in this module, we get into looking at how do we look at physical and logical access to assets. So we will talk about physical concerns about accessing a data center, and then the logical side, which is the computer system level access. We'll look at the different models, like BIBA for integrity, or BLP, which is one for confidentiality. And we'll talk about the history and how the models combine to get to where we are today, where we worry about confidentiality, integrity. How do we make sure that if we look at, for example, the top secret model, we know that if you've got secret level clearance, that you shouldn't be able to read top secret data. Nor should you be able to write secret data to confidential level data that's lower than this. And so this module will get into the sort of history and the design and the concepts on how those models were created, the logic behind those models, why they were created, and how they actually work in real life. And you'll find a lot of this information we cover in CISSP is actually quite fascinating. It will certainly, let's say, flick the lights on to certain concepts that we tend to take for granted in our everyday work. Domain 6, the security assessment and the testing. So we're going to get into another broad range of testing methods. We like to, of course, be very clear in our understanding of penetration testing versus vulnerability scanning in terms of the skill sets involved, the standards, the accreditation standards, the approach, the tools, and it's important that you don't or you aren't confused between one versus the other, because one requires a lot of professional skills. So penetration testing requires professional expertise, it requires a lot of training, experience, and human intervention. It's really a very highly skilled person combining experience and tools from a number of different systems in order to achieve a result, which is sanctioned, contractually agreed test to do exactly what a hacker would do or what a threat actor would do. And that would be to achieve a proof of concept to determine whether or not a system is vulnerable to attack, and if it is vulnerable, where are the vulnerabilities? When we talk about vulnerability scanning, of course, we're just assessing the latest patching and firmware levels, which is a largely automated process and doesn't require lots of technical skill sets. But we'll talk a lot about the differences between the two. And I would expect to see penetration testers or people with experience in these skill sets to be on the course. So we'll look at designing and how do we design and validate an assessment? How do we do a test and an audit? How would we approach the conduct of security control testing? Because you as a practitioner would need to then be able to take this information from your CISSP experience and apply it to the workplace. You'll be the person engaging with and hiring a penetration tester or overseeing a project to implement a vulnerability scanning system. And then the ability to then the after action. So once you've done the tests, the analysis of test output, the generation of reports, and how does that affect things like the risk profile of an organization? You know, where do you document the output and whose responsibilities are going to be to remediate those issues that are identified in the actual testing? Penetration testing, for example, when we get penetration testing people on the course, I like penetration testers because they're very experienced, they're very technical. I don't see penetration testers in my experience finding the CISSP course any more easier than anybody else, but it's just one very specialized area of knowledge that I like to, as an instructor, is I like to draw upon each of the students' experiences. And rather than me just talking all the time from the book, I'm very much like to engage with students on the course to share their experiences and to validate what we're actually going through in the learning material. And so that benefits everybody through the training, not just myself, for example, or the penetration tester. Move on to Domain 7. So Domain 7, we'll get into security operations. This is a little bit more of the day-to-day tasks that are required to keep security services operating reliably and efficiently. In the operations section, we get more, although we've touched it in previous domains, we get more into detail now about business continuity planning and how that relates to disaster recovery planning. We talk about things like business impact assessments, types of risk assessments that allow us to understand the potential for risk in terms of cost, return on security investment. It allows us to understand the frequency of risk and the likelihood of not just a risk materializing, but what type of an investment should we be applying to that problem. And so we'll look at a little bit of the sort of quantitative and the qualitative analysis techniques that will enable us to make credible determinations on how much resource, whether it be financial or physical resource, people or process and technology, to come up with a credible decision on how much we should be applying to solve a problem. Meaning that, when we have an asset, let's say, and a resource that's worth, let's say, £1 million, but we wouldn't want to spend £900,000 protecting that £1 million resource. We want a more balanced approach because we're looking at the potential for risk, not just over a point in time, but over a period of time, whether it's the potential for something happening within a given year, or possibly the likelihood of a risk event only happening once in every 5 years or 10 years. And a lot of this would depend, of course, your corporate's experience in the matter. But nevertheless, we give you the quantitative and the qualitative analysis techniques to be able to do this yourself. So it's not just knowledge. There is real takeaway from this course program that you can go back to your company environment with and apply actual practical techniques back to your office or back to whatever environment that you're working in. And finally, in Domain 8, we get into software development. And again, we look at more software, more life cycles. We have the secure software development life cycle. Most of us are familiar with SDLC, software development lifecycle, but when we talk about secure, again, we're talking about, and so what do we do? How do we safely and secure the asset, the data, when an application is no longer required, when that software is no longer going to be upgraded and it's going to be retired? What happens to the physical assets that we're housing or that was hosting the application system? Was it in the cloud? And the data itself, how do we secure this? What's the strategy we need to consider? And that would encompass everything from our backups to our retiring infrastructure to moving in a new piece of code or a new application, possibly on a new type of coding technology. Perhaps we're moving away from C++ and moving over to .NET. And cloud is, of course, when we talk about cloud, it's not as easy to to move an application into a cloud environment, which might necessitate the redesigning of a software solution. And so we have to consider the best approach to development software. You, from a, let's say, not so much of an auditor point of view, but from a security reviewer, need to ensure that your developers are following best practice, that they're following the appropriate models in place to make sure that known vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting or SQL injection, that those types of code flaws are not being embedded into new applications that are being developed. And it's not that you're actually getting in and testing the code yourself, but you're there to make sure that they're following the due diligence, the best practices, that their approach to development and the management of the development teams is appropriate, it is up to date, and it is in accordance to best practice. And your job as a professional, as a security professional, is to ensure that you have a positive engagement with those development teams, that you have oversight over the secure software development lifecycle, that you have a number of different assurance activities to assist with the people that are actually developing that code, and so that when you finally get to that point where you're ready for a production release, that both you as a security practitioner, the software development, and the executive management can all be satisfied with collective responsibility that everything that could have been done has been done to ensure that a secure product is being released, whether it's for internal use or for public use. And so we cover a variety of concepts. How do we integrate security? And there's lots of things that you as a security practitioner would need to be involved in, identifying how to apply security controls, ensuring we have a properly segregated environment, that we have development and we have a segregated operational environment, and hopefully preferably a UA or a test environment. We assess the effectiveness of software security, and we also look at the impact of, if we're buying software off the shelf, how do we assess that? How do we assess third-party software? So it's not just the software we're developing ourselves, but how can we provide a healthy oversight so we can be accountable to our executive management at all times that we've got a secure solution that we're deploying. Well, that's the summary of the CISSP program, the 8 domains. Now it's a little bit of a sales pitch and some of my background on the benefits of accreditation, things I can share with you. So certainly it is definitely globally the most in-demand certification. It was in 1994 when it was first created. I wrote the examination that would have been about 13 years later, just as Citibank had picked it up and decided that this would be an important program for the development of our professionals within the organization. So I've got Citibank to thank for taking me down this path. And certainly it had a massive impact on my career. I was able to gain a promotion as I was competing for a new role. Having attained the CISSP accreditation during that competition certainly helped in the selection process for me to get that job. I also found that once I actually had that accreditation, that I was starting to get headhunted, and was offered my first contract about a year and a half later outside of Citigroup. So it certainly had quite a positive impact on me, and I've maintained my accreditation ever since. So I'm still a good member in good standing all these years later with IC Square. Still pay my membership dues, still do my CPE credits, although as an instructor, it's a lot easier to do that when you're teaching. But again, every course, virtually when you take one 5-day course, you get almost a whole year's worth of continuing professional education credits. And what continuing professional education credits are, it's the requirement to maintain your CISSP status, that you need to earn a minimum of 20 per year, but on average 40 per year, up to 120 over a 3-year period. Meaning that every 3 years, they look at your accreditation and your standing. They need to make sure that you've paid your membership dues, that you've got at least 20 per year, and by the end of the 3 years, you've got 120 total. 120 continuing professional education credits that proves that you are doing what is necessary to stay informed, that you are reading white papers, taking training courses, and a whole, like going to a webinar, for example, could be worth, an hour-long webinar could be worth 1 CP credit. But you're constantly maintaining, you're focusing on further education, and that's really what the ISC Square expects for all the members. So certainly there is a number of documented look at salaries and how salaries improved over the years. That certainly was an influencing factor that when I took the CISSP program, and I used to be a Unix systems admin, and I did some studies and I looked at some of the projected salary improvements for things like database administrators and sysadmin, and I compared it to the security industry. Well, that was pretty exciting because, and even today, you'll still see that security is certainly on the rise, and that there is certainly a fiscal benefit of getting these accreditations. Also being part of ISC Square. So once you passed your exam, you've taken your training course with InfosecTrain, you've done the exam, and you're now a member, because you can't be a member of ISC Square until you pass an exam. They certainly do offer a number of things, a lot of free webinars, conferences, they have monthly chapter meetings. All over the world, there are chapters set up that you can attend, well, virtually for now, of course, but in person. Free monthly journals, which is helpful. If you read that monthly journal every month, that's worth CP credits. The networking, meeting a lot of people. So, it can be a very lonely job working as a security professional in an organization where you don't have a lot of peers, let's say, to relate to. When you're an information security officer, let's say, in a company, there might be a few of you. You might be the only one if you're a small company. And so being a member of ISC Square allows you a network of people to reach out to connect with, to help problem solve, and vice versa, for you to be there for them, for you to help them problem solve, share experiences when looking at vendors, experiences deploying products and solutions. And without ISC Square, really, who do you reach to? Well, we've got LinkedIn, of course, but ISC Square is like-minded people with similar accreditations. And I'll tell you what, the sense of achievement, I cannot undersell how good I felt when I passed that exam. Like I had really accomplished something. And I think a lot of that partly was because it'd been a number of years since I was in school. And it was pretty daunting writing an exam of that length. Even now, even though it's only 3 hours now, it's intense. You're going to be nonstop for those 3 hours. And the amount of effort that it takes to go through that content and to get yourself to a position where you feel confident, it's no small feat. And like anything, nothing worth doing is ever easy. And this program is worth doing. And I can't stress that enough. It is a fantastic feeling of achievement. Pretty much all I've got to say about that. Like I said, if hopefully I'll get to meet some of you on training courses in the future where I'll have more time to storytell and tell you how teary-eyed I was when I achieved my first accreditation. But no, I can't stress it enough. It is definitely the right qualification to get if you're looking to advance in the cybersecurity industry. Yep, thank you all for attending today. I really appreciate your time and effort on a Friday. I know it's evening time for you all, so I really appreciate it. And I really hope to see you on a training course in 2021. All right, thank you very much, everybody.